to be with all of you today. So some of you mentioned, I saw you nodding or raising your hands, that you're interested in law, maybe studying law in the United States. I'm going to try to give you as close as an experience as we can. Now, I didn't have readings. I asked if I could give readings for you to do ahead of time. And we thought maybe not. So this is more lecture than you'll typically get in law schools in the United States. But we're going to start together. And I have some questions for you. And I want to hear from you about whether these things are corruption. So a university student gives a modestly priced gift to her professor after she gets a good grade on her assignment. Who thinks this is corruption? What? So quick to raise your hand. Why is that corruption?
Because it's unethical, I assume.
Unethical? Something's wrong? You raised your hand?
Yeah, because it shouldn't be this way, because that is her or his job, and like you shouldn't be gifted for this because you get money for that.
I get a paycheck. I don't get gifts, right?
Yeah.
But many of you didn't raise your hands. Who didn't raise their hand? Why not?
Because sometimes we have a situation we wanted like just to say thank you, and it's really we don't expect something for that, and it's just a thank you. But of course, if we speak about law, it may be considered as a bribe or something like that.
Maybe, but the motivation seems important to you. Maybe
Yes,
culturally a small gift of thank you. I enjoyed this assignment. I enjoyed the class.
It's just like the culture. It's just to say thank you. So
Maybe it's a flowers because there is like written modestly priced gift. Maybe it's just a flowers.
Maybe modestly priced. Maybe that makes a difference.
Another thing, like if you give it before they give you some service, that's like very obvious.
Well, we'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, if you talk about corruption, we have some control by law about price of corruption and gifts. How much does it cost?
Sure.
So if it's modestly priced, it's not a corruption. It can maybe just a gift, just a present.
Okay. New situation. A gift before a final grade in the course. Does this change for you? Why does it change?
because it may because the person who receives the gift may think that it's now I owe something to you. So it changes.
Do you agree that's what you were? Yes? Okay, how's this? A university applicant is granted admission after the admissions office receives a call from her uncle who works for the Ministry of Education, which grants licenses to universities. Is that corruption?
Sounds like that.
Sounds like that? No hands are going up ever so quickly now. Your hands were up sooner. What if the applicant is otherwise qualified? Does that make a difference? Without the phone call, the applicant probably would get in. The phone call doesn't make a difference. Are we okay?
I think first one is not a corruption because he's just granted for admission, and the second one, if he's qualified, means that he passed the admission after the call. So maybe it smells like corruption.
It smells like corruption. It sounds like corruption. What about this? A student applies to attend a prestigious school, meets the minimum qualifications, is admitted, but their father is very wealthy, a graduate of the program, and has been giving a lot of money every year as a donation to the school. Are we nervous? No?
That happens all the time.
This happens all the time.
It's hard to check.
It's hard to check. You want to learn more about this situation before.
About this particular, if I'm interested.
Okay. Okay.
If some journalist is.
Sure. Here's an interesting one. A foreign student is granted admission to a university after paying $5,000 to a visiting professor who happens to be in the region, showing off the program. Corruption?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Stupidity. I mean, the wages the professors get, they wouldn't risk it for $5,000.
Well, we won't get into how much or how much we're not paid because the dean of my law school may be watching us right now. So I don't want to seem dissatisfied. But these questions are taken from examples in legal contexts in my class. I teach a class in our program, in our LL.M program in democratic governance and rule of law in corruption. It's called Competitiveness and Corruption. And those are examples I give to my students on the first day of class, but in different contexts, with judges, with government officials, sometimes the education context, to see what is this amorphous thing called corruption. I want to talk to you a little bit about my program, why I'm here, what we do with our LL.M, and what you can learn if you wanted to study at Ohio Northern University. And then I'm going to talk to you more about corruption. I'm going to try to condense a lot of what we cover in an entire semester in the span of 30 minutes. And then I want to talk a little bit about the contexts of what's going on here in your country, and maybe looking at some other countries and seeing how can we maybe look at a big picture of what's going on here, okay? So we have a program, an LL.M in democratic governance and rule of law. We also have a program which is a 3-year program to earn your JD and your LL.M. Your JD is the American Law degree, a Juris Doctorate. It's a post-bachelor's degree that qualifies you to practice in the United States. Some LL.Ms will allow you to take some bar exams and practice as a lawyer. Ours doesn't do that, because our program is specifically designed for lawyers to come and study the rule of law and return to their home countries and implement what they've learned in our classes in whatever agency or NGO or firm that they're working for. Okay, so our curriculum is divided into 3 terms. We have a fall term, and you can see the classes that we offer: an introduction to the American legal system, but in a comparative context, and some comparative classes: administrative law, constitutional law, subjects that are very important in terms of the rule of law, and an issue, private law issues in transitional democracies. We have a short January term where we typically have visiting professors who come and teach for us. We had a member of parliament from Kosovo talk to us about state building one term. We had an Icelandic professor last year about European courts, and a visiting PhD from another country, which escapes me, who's going to be teaching a class on international criminal law. And so we have a lot of flexibility with our short month-long term in January. And then the spring semester, where my class, Competitiveness and Corruption, Public Law, Legal Issues and Transition, a rule of law seminar where students are asked to write a thesis that identifies a rule of law deficiency in their home country and proposes a solution looking at how other countries have solved the same problem. So we're going to give you a thesis to come back and say, okay, I'm ready to reform, right, in my country. And the many electives that are related to our program. I'll talk just a couple of the courses. Private law issues in transitional states. We look at the business environment. How do we encourage investment? How do we strengthen the opportunities to create business, to promote foreign direct investment? How do we secure property rights? How do we give property right owners the availability to protect their rights in the justice system? How do we enforce laws and create laws that protect labor and employment rights for employees? My class, of course, deals with corruption and fighting corruption, but also we look at economics, because you can't look at corruption without thinking in an economic standpoint about the causes and the consequences of the economics of corruption and the costs. And we look at how do you draft laws, what laws apply, what states have successfully fought corruption. And I'm going to make this in 30 or 40 minutes for you today. But you'll have to come to ONU if you want to have the full course. Public law issues. How do we deal in a post-conflict society? How do we deal with employees from a former regime that we may not want in the present regime? I see some of you nodding your heads, right? Lustration, right? Truth commissions. If you had atrocities or mass crimes, what do you do? How do you offer reparations to citizens who have been victims? Okay, this is what we teach in our LL.M. So my class, Anticorruption, fits into this curriculum. If you're interested in being a government lawyer in rule of law and democratic reform, then I would say this is the place to go. We're the only program in the United States that's specifically related to democratic governance and rule of law for an LL.M. There are, of course, more than 100 LL.Ms at the other schools in the United States that deal with various different topics. And so depending on your interests, if some of you I saw were maybe, yes, I want to come study law in the United States, we can talk about that later, or we can talk about that tomorrow at the fair, the other opportunities that are available from other schools. But I, of course, am from Ohio Northern University Law School, and so I wanted to tell you a little bit about my program. Do you have any questions before I move on? Otherwise, we'll have time at the end. Okay, good. So let's talk about corruption. What is corruption? How do we define corruption? Now, in an American law school class, I would just call on you. You would have done your readings, and this is something we call the Socratic Method. I rely on all of you to answer my questions to help lead our discussion, and by doing so, we learn. I see some nervous faces, don't worry. We learn by giving suggestions. We come to the answer together by finding our ways. Maybe we can try it right now, quickly. What is corruption? Yeah.
It's illegal act that is conducted by the state authorities here for their own private
Interest.
Interest, yeah.
Or an illegal act of a person to force state authorities to conduct this illegal act. So it's like either from the side of the government or from the side of a person.
Sure. So an illegal act, and you said for private gain, and you're including the government here in these transactions. Does it necessarily have to be illegal?
No. Well, yes.
No, yes, maybe. You would have read about 30 pages before our class today, and so that would have helped. The long-standing sort of cobbled together definition that's generally accepted, and we kind of got there, is the abuse of public power for private gains. Okay, the abuse of public power for private gains. The United Nations, when they were drafting the UN Convention Against Corruption, said, well, we're having a hard time coming up with a definition. I think we should maybe list offenses. What are the kind of corrupt offenses that we have? And what kinds of corruption we have. Many of you probably can easily recognize the distinction between grand corruption and petty corruption. Grand corruption on a grand scale, right? Millions, hundreds of millions, big plastic wrapped stacks of dollar bills hidden in your office. What's petty? Give me an example of petty corruption.
Everyday corruption, we're paying money for the police not to stop their car, for example.
Sure, that's the first one down. Bribery. I gave you the answer. That's right up there. Very good. Bribery, paying a bribe, a small bribe, right? $3, $4, $5, $10, right? There's nothing grand there. Maybe over time it accumulates, but that's a petty corruption. But bribery, embezzlement, theft, and fraud, criminal offenses usually, extortion, abuse of discretion. We oftentimes think of corruption in terms of public officials and an abuse of their official office, their official functions, or maybe an abuse of their discretion in their office. The class, giving the professor a gift before a grade. Maybe the professor abuses their discretion by giving a higher grade because it was a nicer gift, right? Abuse of discretion. Favoritism, nepotism, clientelism. Do you know the difference between those? Are those familiar terms to you?
Some are.
Some are. Nepotism involving usually a family member that's oftentimes unqualified for a position, but a position is given to them or favor is given to them. Favoritism, rather maybe a similar political party or someone with similar interests, okay? A conflict of interest, exploiting a conflict of interest when you can make decisions that affect your own personal wealth or your situation that you probably should be exempt from doing, and improper political contributions. When we talk about corruption in the United States, this is often where we go. Our legalization of political contributions and how our courts as a common law system have interpreted how corporations can give lots and lots and lots of money to political candidates who then may ultimately act in their interest, okay? But improper political contributions, sometimes they're legal. And this was my question, can we have legal corruption? Maybe. It's worth discussing at Ohio Northern University in my class, okay? But for now, we want to look a little bit more at what causes corruption, what are we dealing with in our own societies. This is a ranking from the Corruption Perception Index, Transparency International. Some of you are nodding your heads, you've heard of Transparency International, the largest NGO dealing with corruption issues in the world. And of course, every year they rank the perceptions of corruptions. They aggregate a bunch of different sources and come up with a ranking for all of our countries, most of our countries, in terms of how we rank. Ukraine, 142 out of the 175 countries that were ranked in the last perception index. Just putting it out there, just stating a fact. Correlated to corruption is often we can find how well can you operate a business? What are the economic opportunities for a citizen or a company or a foreign company in a society? And so we oftentimes look for how business activity is regulated, how easy it is for someone to start a business, to get a license, to get a permit, to have regulated or unregulated economic activities. So oftentimes when we talk about corruption, we also look at the economics of a society. And so the World Bank does this. They put together something called the Doing Business Index, or rating of how the ease of doing business in a country. Have any of you heard of this ranking? It's really worth looking at. And Ukraine has improved its lot by 4 points from 2015 to 2014 with some recent regulatory changes. And so we want to see that number rise. We want it to be easier to do business because if we lessen the amounts of maybe permits we need or steps we need to go through to pay for a license, to pay for a fee, we reduce opportunities for corruption. When we combat corruption, sometimes what we want to do is we want to reduce opportunities, okay, for that petty corruption, for bribes, for this face-to-face interaction that can be exploited. And so we oftentimes look at business regulations. Okay, so if we had a semester instead of 50 minutes, we would look a little more in detail, but I wanted to bring this to your attention for those of you who haven't thought of it. So again, I'm going to go through kind of quickly an overview that we would spend a week or two on in my class about the causes and the costs of corruption. About the first third of my class, we look contextually broadly at what are the various, what are social scientists and lawyers saying about what causes corruption? How can we think amorphously about these things in our context, in our society? Not all of them may exist in a given state or a given situation, but some of them are important that I want to point out at the very end of our time this evening. But size and makeup of the public sector, how big is your bureaucracy, your government employees? Is there a large pool of government employees for tasks that maybe don't need as many? And are they paid very, very low salaries, which incentivizes them to take a risk? Like professors, why would they risk their high-paying job for just a $5,000 bribe? I agree. But if they don't make a lot of money, then all of a sudden that transaction seems a bit more lucrative. You have a lot less to lose if you're very low paid. The quality of regulation. This again, we look at it oftentimes in business, but all around administrative law and codified law. What is the quality of the laws? Are they enforceable? Do they give opportunities for corrupt interactions? Economic competition. Whether you have an economically competitive society that inherently has a check on some of those activities. The structure of government. And by that I mean democracy. I mean a check from different government institutions. Some of you that may have learned about the United States legal system, one of the terms that we use all the time is that checks and balances. We have 3 systems of government, and they're by design made to check the power and authority of each other. So one of them, for instance, the executive, or the legislature can't become too powerful. What kind of structure do you have? The literature suggests that, well, a weak democracy doesn't do much for us in this respect. And so we need a strong representative democracy if that's what we're going to have, with increased competition for that political mandate. So if someone abuses their authority, we can have a process that removes them from office, okay, in the structure of the governance, okay? How decentralized your government is? What happens when you take power and disperse it amongst others? You remove, yeah, what were you gonna say? That's fine. Decentralization, you spread the monopoly on power to other sources.
Divide responsibilities.
Divide responsibilities, exactly. You can't have a monopoly on power. Culture, critically important when we talk about corruption in two ways. Culture within an agency. Okay, we can think of an administrative agency or a judiciary or anything. Think of any organization that can have a culture of corruption that has endured for decades, right? But you also have a societal culture that maybe has grown to accept, well, this is the society we live in. This is our culture. I have to pay a bribe if I want to cross that bridge. I have to pay a bribe if I want a driver's license. That's just how it is. I can't do anything about it. It's our culture. Okay, there are two ways that culture can cause corruption, the problem of corruption. Values, gender, gentlemen, some scholars have suggested that men are more corrupt than women. Some, okay? I won't name them, we won't get too far into it. But there's some argument that maybe some countries with more women in power have lower levels of corruption. That in some societal contexts, I see some of you smiling and looking at one another, societal contexts, that women are less corrupt than men. Okay, but again, maybe this is just a correlation. Maybe we see in more democratic societies with lower levels of corruption, there are more women involved in the political process, and maybe that's all it is. The men are agreeing now. Yeah,
That's maybe because there are less women in the government, and those who are really, they are like the best. That's why the
maybe.
is lower.
I see a thesis in your future, but it's something worth investigating. Is that a cause? Our history, certainly our geography. If I brought that map up again, Ukraine isn't an island amongst its neighbors in terms of corruption. Geography typically matters. Our influence interaction with our neighboring states and our allies, but also history, okay? We won't get into history. I will just say our history matters in terms of prior regimes, going back as to what happens recurrently in our government. And of course, a lack of political will. Do our leaders who have a monopoly on power or may have more power, do they want change? Or are they just seeking to enrich themselves and protect their sphere of influence at whatever level? That is a cause of corruption, okay? General overview. Some of them that we're gonna come back to, the size and makeup of the public sector and specifically salaries, the structure of our government, and our laws, the increased or decreased role government creates for corruption, and decentralization, and of course, culture, okay? I'll bring those up again, but have them in the back of your mind as I continue. So costs, I won't speak too long on this issue, but inequality, economic inequality, lower overall GDP per capita, lower GDP growth. If you have a corrupt system, foreign investors are hesitant to come and operate businesses in your state because there's no protection under the law. We can't be guaranteed that my interests as a foreign business will be protected in a court system that's corrupt, or in a legal system that doesn't offer me protections. Or in some contexts, many states, like the United States, have laws that say you as an American corporation can't come to Ukraine or anywhere else and pay bribes and operate corruptly. You can't do it. You violate American law, and you will forfeit profits, you will pay fines, maybe go to jail. Okay, so there are lots of barriers to economic growth when we have corruption. And that's why we oftentimes look at business. Public sector, of course, our services diminish. If we have a corrupt agency, we can't get things as fast as we want. We can't get the quality of service we want. Nepotism and clientelism and favoritism, when we appoint even bureaucrats at any level that aren't qualified for their job, then they can't give government services that are as good as we need them to. And so we have an effect on how well our government runs and operates. That is a cost that you can't always put a price on, but we feel it. It's affected in our society. And of course, the promotion of an underground economy. The dollar figures, I have them in US dollars, are quite staggering. $1 trillion annually paid in bribes.
Where?
Worldwide. Worldwide. This is from the World Bank, an estimation. But 5% of the global GDP is lost to corruption. It increases the cost of doing business. Of course, if your profit margin is reduced by having to pay bribes to operate, that has an effect on society's ability to advance, of course, if your economy can't grow enough. And lots and lots and lots of money of development assistance is lost every year to corruption. So the world could be a better place without corruption. Do we agree? Yeah, okay, so how do we fix it? Let's fix it. Let's figure out how we can fix it in the next half hour. Some correlations, GDP and corruption. The higher GDP we have, and the better ranking a country is on the Transparency International's index. So we see a relationship, statistically speaking, in human development from the UN, which measures wealth, health, and education. So the more a country improves in those areas, we see a relationship with corruption. So think of it the other way. The gains to fighting corruption could be astronomical for a society. We increase our wealth, we increase our health. And so we can find ways between these correlations to say, I think we can find ways to improve society, okay? Unfortunately, there isn't one answer. There isn't one solution. There are a variety of discrete efforts that we can make or elaborate plans that can be put into action, okay? And so, of course, we are in Ukraine, as you know. For those of you watching at home, you might not be. But we are in Ukraine, and so we're interested in what kinds of reforms are happening here. Not just we in the room, but the world. The United States has taken a significant interest and investment in fighting corruption in Ukraine and seeing what's happening. Those of us that sort of work in this field and investigate this field are interested to see what's going to happen here. So this is probably not news to you or to you all, but there are a variety of things that are happening, right, that are in process, okay? A Lustration Act. Have any of you heard of this? I should ask before I continue, are there any lawyers in the room? Okay. You're the most talkative too. It makes sense that we talk more than everyone else. Anyone who's interested in being a lawyer? You that aren't raising your hands are the smart ones in the room. No, so the Lustration Act, what is lustration? You mentioned it earlier. No?
Maybe something to get through about the profit of all people who took very high position in our country, such as judges, president, and so on.
Yeah, you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's a process when after the regime changes and we want to make some changes in the country, those people who were in the previous government and governmental authorities, they can't take part in the new government. So they need to kind of wait. Sometimes it's forever to the end of their life. They can't take part in the governmental authority. Sometimes it's for some period of time, like 5-10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Maybe Are our leaders honest before us or not?
Right. Are the leaders
Especially
honest
about,
before?
their benefits.
Yes. Yes. You were going to say.
I think one of the best examples is Estonia, when after the USSR times, they signed a law that all members of the USSR party or Communist Party, they can't have any positions in the government and in structures, governmental structures.
It's
So
limitation.
You were a member of the former government, and now you cannot be a member of the new government because we are reforming, right? This has happened countless times throughout history, more recent history, throughout the world. When we have a regime change, how do we evaluate, how do we vet someone to say, were you part of the problem? Were you part of the problems in governance that we were experiencing before? And if you were, we don't want you part of the governance now because those same problems are going to creep in. And so how we do that becomes politically challenging. The efforts we make can sometimes be clouded in an appearance, sometimes at least an appearance of political motivations, even if there aren't facts. And so we want to develop a process by which we can do this in sort of a fair investigatory way, so we're not punishing someone just by the sake of them doing a good job in a former regime, not the current regime, etc. So, so we have a 2014 Lustration Act in Ukraine, and several people that have been sacked, right, from their jobs as a result of that, and the investigation is still ongoing. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau, very common. Have you heard of this yet?
Yep.
Yeah. Is it functioning yet?
Yeah. Almost.
Yeah?
Almost, yeah.
Almost, yeah. Still working on. They've appointed a head.
We are waiting for a specialized prosecutor.
Yes. Yes. A very common tool that's used in anti-corruption systems to create an independent agency that's designed for one purpose: to fight corruption. I was fortunate enough to be in Malawi earlier this summer at the Anti-Corruption Bureau in Malawi, where they're doing a tremendous job trying to prosecute those that took part in what's perhaps the biggest corruption scheme ever in Africa, certainly in Malawi, that stretched over 2 administrations. But a bureau and a government agency that is independent, truly independent, and that has the authority to investigate and prosecute corrupt acts. Okay, so the creation of the Anti-Corruption Bureau that you all have heard about. The law, of course, a law preventing corruption. A lot of times we can see a criminal code that incorporates some things that we might say are corrupt acts, right? Theft. Okay, theft is a crime. We see it in criminal codes often. Embezzlement is a crime that we see often. Bribery, maybe. But we see in many states laws that specifically say these are corrupt acts, attempts at corruption, if we're going to punish attempts at corruption, mechanisms by which we can give authority to agencies to fight corruption. And so, of course, we have a law on preventing corruption and a national agency for the prevention of corruption that is doing things like verifying asset declarations of government officials. Where is your wealth coming from? Can you show us? Can you prove us how you got the money in your bank account? And if you can't, then we have a problem, right? And a public procurement law. How are bids and tenders awarded in a government? If I need to pave a road or build a bridge or a building, who gets that contract? My brother. No. We need a transparent process. We need a way that we can have a fair awarding of government funds to engage in any kind of projects, public works projects, so we don't lose money. There's kind of an old tale. I won't say where I heard it. It wasn't here, but it was about the layers of a road, the layers that we need to build a road. You know, when you build a road, you have different layers. So the first layer goes to the governor, and the second layer goes to the mayor, and the third layer goes to the city administrator. And then the fourth layer, that is actually part of the road. They actually pave the road with that one. So we lose money when we have corrupt systems, when we have closed ways of spending public money. Okay, so it's critically important to account for all the money that a government spends. And so how do we do that? We can have a transparent procurement process where we can say, okay, and of course we need a robust media that can relay this information to the public, or a way that we can effectively interact with seeing our ledgers. But this is our money, right? This is our taxpayer money. This is our government's money. I want to see how it's being spent, how it's being awarded, and it's being done so in a just way. Okay, so a critically important reform that we see happening here. But what is the biggest thing that we're paying attention to, certainly in the West, in the United States? The patrol police, right? Yep, I see, yep, yes. Lot of attention being paid to this reform. And there are a few reasons why, which I'll talk about. Or you can tell me, why are a lot of people saying, this is good, this is a good reform? What's good about this?
Because there was an independent way how they chose these people to go to this agency. So every person could take part in the competition and become a member of the police. That's why it was like something new and maybe something without corruption. And we know these people. That's also, some people know these people, so we can like understand that it's possible. It's really true. It's not somebody somewhere. It's real people.
You meet the people. You hear how they applied. 30,000, 40,000 people apply for 2,000 positions, right? Yeah. A competitive process where people are vetted. People who weren't part of the former police, right? And are being trained in something new, a new way to enforce things independently from others. Yeah. Anything else? What else do you know?
Let me make a suggestion. Let's say I live in a block of flats. Yeah, no, in this city in Kiev. Yeah, and next to my house, next to my entrance, yeah, from where I live, there was a illegal place for trading goods. Yeah, open area. And I called 7 times in one day, police. They came every time, checked the situation, and came back. Yeah, and I called 7 times and said, we have a militia, yeah, militia and police, yeah, and they said me called only militia, maybe they would be able to improve the situation. Yeah, so I want to say that the same situation I looked at the Vokzalna subway station, yeah, when were illegal places, police came and checked the situation, and in half an hour they went on this selling of goods. Yeah, so when I said that police in Ukraine doesn't work, they have, and the policeman himself explained everything and said, no, they earn 8,000 hryvnias per month. Yeah, usual militiaman earns not more than 2,500. Yeah, but they do nothing. These are you understand what I mean?
I do. You've gotten 2 points that I want to make.
I know it from real life.
Yeah,
from books, not from news.
Oh, but the news is always correct. No, no, and there's criticism to everything we're looking at. Everything we're looking at from here on out, and we're going to look at other reforms that I call successful. But there's reasons to criticize them. But you mentioned something about salaries being higher as a way to incentivize these new police officers to not take a bribe and lose your job, right? There's the idea behind it. And you at least are saying they're responding.
You know, excuse me, I watched girls in these cars, police cars. They're not American policemen, women. You know what I mean? Yeah, they so tiny. They can do nothing. Yeah, if it comes to real battle, to real fight,
I have to respectfully disagree because no, I will tell you that I've encountered many women who could really hurt me extraordinarily, and not just emotionally, but physically. And I know the training that, with all due respect, that the women in various states go through for military and police, and I would not want to be on the wrong side of them. Okay, so I think we can agree to disagree on that point. But this is what is having a lot of focus. Okay, you mentioned all new people, an open competitive process, higher wages. We see them. I saw several of these cars on my way from the airport to my hotel 2 days ago when I arrived. A change, a very visual change. that with those other reforms that are being undertaken hits some key highlights, okay? And maybe, and I won't conclude quite yet, but starts a foundation for where we have seen successful reforms. Now, my wife, who may or may not be watching right now and can't respond, may disagree when I say I'm an idealist. And so when I think about law reform, when I think about rule of law, if I think about democratic governance, I seize onto things that work, things that have been successful. And while we have criticism with reforms, maybe some of what we're seeing with the patrol police and some of the other efforts from the previous slide are creating a foundation for what can be successful reform. And I want to give you some examples from various countries around the world. Liberia certainly still has problems with corruption. Now, none of the countries, save one that I'll mention, I would say is relatively free of corruption. But Liberia has improved its governance and reduced corruption through a variety of ways. Lustration. Rather than limiting to one agency, they put through this process in multiple agencies, okay? Whereas a wholesale, right, way of doing it, a code of conduct for public workers that really limits how bureaucrats can behave, and of course increased wages, a successful anti-corruption commission in law, procurement reform that was very open and transparent, and increasing economic development through their extractive industry. There are some mineral wealth there that was being exploited relatively easily. And so how can we put checks on that to make sure that we're having economic prosperity there and the state isn't losing its resources from corruption? And we've seen some improvements there. Some of this should sound familiar, right? So probably a reason you're familiar with Georgia for a variety of contexts, including the patrol police, of course. But very successful reform after a regime change in Georgia, a wholesale reform. Again, this lustration and vetting throughout, and even bringing in, maybe familiar, outsiders, right? To come in who haven't even interacted with the former regime. Not just were you in the former regime and clean. No, we don't want you. We want a complete rebirth of these agencies, so we have no shadow left of what was ailing us before. Of course, wage reform, also codes of conduct. You'll see sort of these ethical guidelines. A lot of our professions have ethical guidelines. Doctors, lawyers are bound by ethical rules, and if we don't behave a certain way, we have professional consequences. If I behave in a certain way, I can lose my license to practice law in the United States. So I have ethical rules I follow. Well, government officials too have to abide by certain ethical rules, certain codes of conduct. Otherwise, they risk, of course, losing their jobs, maybe criminal prosecution for what they're doing. Okay, business reform, significant amounts of deregulation, completely removing barriers to operating business in Georgia. You had to have permits and licenses before. No, complete opening it up, laissez-faire economic development. Why? Because opportunities for corruption and interaction. You need a permit, you need a license, you have to go see these 3 different people to get 3 different stamps and then submit your application. Bribe, bribe, bribe. Bribe, yes. It's not always complex, right? And so we can reduce opportunities. I often say you want to reduce the opportunities for corrupt transactions as a way to combat it. It's a good starting point, okay? Which is what I included on my slide, actually. That's why I say it a lot. Rwanda, the interesting thing about Rwanda is one of their bigger, more successful reforms was creating strong independent agencies. Now, there's tremendous political will in this country for reform in this area, okay? And so we have an ombudsperson, we have the Auditor General, a public procurement process that is a model, certainly for the region. Judicial reform, a lot of judges who have been prosecuted for corruption. I mean, a relatively corrupt-free judiciary at this point, and a lot of economic reform institutions that operate independently, that are strong, that are backed by the political will of the executive, but that have brought real consequences to those that were engaging in corruption. And this, in fact, this country is the second least corrupt in Africa, behind Botswana, and has made the most tremendous improvement over the course of their reforms. And so it's a model that we want to look at. The other thing, they looked at bureaucracy of public employees. So you've seen on the way in the building that there are all these decorations for Halloween. And as I was walking through here with a colleague, she said, "You need to talk about these decorations." I said, "I don't know how I can do it." But then I saw these ghosts hanging above the door, and I thought, I know how I can talk about these decorations. And it's Halloween, just about. There were ghost workers that were being paid in the bureaucracy here. Not real people, but money was being distributed to a ghost worker that then was being collected by someone else. Okay, so an administration that was siphoning off funds to employees that didn't exist. Okay, so we fired all the ghost workers, and then we reduced the size of the bureaucracy as well. So that's how I was able to bring in the ghosts. Okay, Singapore, one of the least corrupt countries in the world. Why? Strong focus on economic development, strong agency report, an early reformer for anti-corruption laws, but increased salaries. So we talked about the difference in the patrol police and their salaries. Singapore increased salaries that would make them competitive with the private sector. So if you're the head of a ministry, you're going to make roughly the same as the CEO of a major corporation. Talk about incentivizing your position to govern justly, because what you have to lose is really, really significant. Now, there obviously were some economics that allowed them to do that. Okay, this isn't a reform. Every state can't start paying their ministers a whole lot of money, but it's combined. As we reduce corruption, we can increase economic activity. We might be able to increase foreign domestic investment when we have a stronger judiciary and court system and legal regime that protects property rights of foreign businesses, that increases our wealth. So I said there's not one simple solution. I can't just flip a switch on corruption. There are many ways that we attack corruption, and these countries give us some insight into how we might do that. How have other countries fought this with a regulatory scheme that promotes economy, with a criminal justice scheme or an investigatory agencies that allow us to independently seek out crimes of corruption and punish corruption? The last example is not a state, but a city, capital of Bolivia, La Paz, which teaches us a few important lessons. But the former mayor of La Paz went in, Mayor McClan, and went in and did a lot of reform economically and bureaucratically. Again, firing a lot of workers, but firing workers, the most recently hired ones. We don't need all of you, okay? And he did something very important in terms of permitting. One thing that he did is he removed the place where you pay for a permit and the place where the person makes a decision about a permit, okay? You don't have it the same place. I need to pay a fee, and then I will approve or deny you. No. You pay a fee, you deposit your paperwork, and it goes somewhere else, up in the top of the building, actually. And they don't get to interact with the person that has the money and pays the money. So you remove an opportunity, also by reducing your bureaucracy, but you reduce discretion, okay? Abuse of power often comes when someone has discretion to abuse that power, and when you take that away, you don't give them the opportunity to say, I will grant you this permit or this license, or I will waive this fee for you if you pay me, or if you employ my nephew, or if you do any sort of thing that is an abuse of power for private gain, right? And so what we saw them do was reduce opportunities. by changing the way their bureaucracy operates, reducing the numbers, reducing the steps it takes to engage in those kind of processes. A very interesting tax reform, tax collectors were taking bribes. So if you owned a home in La Paz and it was valued at $10,000, you don't want it to be assessed at $10,000. You want to say the house is worth $5,000, so I pay less taxes. So I can bribe the tax collector and say, I want you to value my house lower so I pay less in taxes. Everybody wins, right? The taxpayer doesn't pay as much. You're nodding your heads. Don't nod your heads. Everybody loses. The taxpayer pays less. The tax collector gets to eat steak every night and a nice bottle of wine. And the government just is operating as usual, right, in poverty. So they said, and this is really interesting. I don't know that I recommend this everywhere. They said, you value your home and pay your bill. And then we're just going to go and check out the value of what you declared and see if you were being honest. And then at the fear of being caught cheating, people started saying, oh yeah, my home is worth 10,000, not 5. It's strange. And they found actual honesty because of the fear of the repercussions, okay, of operating dishonestly. A very unique way to approach it. And of course, with deregulation. Now, this provides another great lesson because the mayor lost his election, and then there was backsliding. And then a lot of the reforms that he instituted, a lot of privatization too. I don't think I talked about that. But having government services to private companies instead of having public works projects. The garbage was collected by private agencies rather than the public. And it saved money for a variety of reasons. He left. Those reforms were undone, and we saw income levels fall, we saw corruption go up, we saw governance backslide, okay? And so when we talk about reforms, we often want to think in our minds, is this sustainable? Is this something that's going to work? Is it going to continue to work? Are we just on the cusp of what was a great, regime change or revolution, and we're riding a wave that will just falter and we'll go back to our old culture of corruption? We'll just fall back to our old ways. This happens time and time again, right? We can't have real sustainable reform without certain things, without political will, without reducing opportunities. So La Paz gives us a good warning that there are some really good lessons to learn here, but we need to make sure that they transcend our leaders, that they last throughout different administrations, that they will survive when our government changes, okay? And so this is a good story to remind us of that. Okay, so I want to go back. We're going to end a little bit early, but we have a lot of time for questions. Some concluding thoughts that I want to give in terms of looking at what's happening in your country right now, what similarities we see. You should have seen some similarities from those 5 other reform efforts, okay, and what's going on here. And that's a good thing. We've seen successful reforms that were born from some of the same things that are happening now. So when I say a first step or building a foundation, the right things are being done to set us on a course to really improve governance or to really combat corruption. Now, I told you I was an idealist, and so I'm looking for the good, okay? But I am drawing these lines. These are successful reform efforts. And so quality of regulation. If you have better quality of regulation, you can have less corruption. Certainly the Anticorruption Bureau, the law preventing corruption, we're codifying rules in a better way. At least they weren't before. We're creating institutions that at least weren't there before. So we're creating a scenario in which we can better fight corruption. The size and makeup of the public sector. Now, the agency reform at the patrol police level at least gives us that idea that we've seen broad-based reforms across agencies that have done the same thing. This vetting, this open competitive process for hiring, increasing salaries, We're not doing that across all agencies, but we did here. And that has been proven to work, okay? So that's a good thing. Certainly the lustration is finding its way through other areas in administration and other agencies and is continuing. So that we can say is good. And the culture, I don't know, maybe I ask you, maybe we don't say, maybe we think about it for a while. Is the culture changing? Do we see some positive reinforcement of cultural change, at least to set a change in motion? Of course, this can't change overnight. And one of the causes I mentioned earlier was culture and history, right? And so we can't undo a century of a culture of corruption with one reform. It takes a lot to change our culture in anything, right? In any, not just corruption, except fashion. It changes very quickly. I can never keep up. But in our societal values, culture changes take a long time. So maybe we can start to see a shift in culture. Both we won't accept this anymore. We're starting to see some reforms, and this needs to continue. And if it doesn't, we can react, whether it's democratically, right? Or somehow else try to hold our leaders accountable. But also agencies themselves can change their culture. And maybe, we don't know yet, it's far too soon, but maybe the culture in the patrol police will be maintained, and that can have maybe broader effects. You drop a stone in a pond, right? And it ripples. So again, I am hopeful individual. So I want to say that we're moving in the right step here in Ukraine. And I confidently can say that because we can draw the parallels to the other successful reforms. Okay, now, that's all I'm gonna say. Because I can't predict the future. If I could, I'd gamble. Yeah.
I just have a question, and the thing I was thinking for quite a long time is, we did this great reform with police. It was, I mean, noticeable all over Ukraine, but sometimes I feel after this big push, it can be lost behind all other things. And I can still see the police, the regular militia, as they call it in other cities, and there's still, I think, the militia training even in Kiev. And sometimes I feel like, well, it was a good push at the beginning, but after like a year or two, it can be, absorbed back in the old corruption. Is that even possible? I mean, I feel like it's kind of possible, very, very possible thing. Do you think it's like somehow predictable, or is there a way to change it?
Maybe. What do you all think? This is the best part about being a professor. If I don't want to answer a question, I can just say, well, what do you think? So I'm going to answer your question, but I want to hear what you think. And maybe if anyone else. This is it. This is the $50,000 question. Yeah.
I think they're a joke even right now. Like, they stopped
the church
Head of the
Guy.
church.
well, a chief of the church. They stopped him because his driver was basically speeding, and he said, "Hey, I am like the main Pope guy," and they let him go. Not so long ago, there was they caught street racers, where some of them were actually trying to take the gun away from one of the police officers. No one was arrested, no one was shot, and they didn't even give a single ticket out. There's too many like they're more like kids. They're not serious. Like, if you would try to take a gun away from a U.S. officer, you would be dead.
We're not going to go there. If you've seen anything in the media about the police situation in the United States, that is far afield. But you raise an interesting question. Are these isolated incidents that the media latches a hold of and gives us a perception of a broader problem, or do we have a legitimate criticism? Now, a couple of you have suggested that maybe the officers aren't as trained as we would want them to be. And I have read that criticism. Okay, but I don't know. Who else? Who else thinks? Yeah. No. Yeah.
I just, my thought was that I think we moved the wrong direction. I mean, police is good, and especially when the country is facing a lot of, criminal issues, and it's obvious because when people fight in the war, the flow of arms and, and armor in general is huge. But I think it should have been started from education field, and we have a lot of universities all over Ukraine. I mean, the number is huge, and sometimes I think, like, why do we need so many? And I would, and the education reform is kind of about this. We close the ones which don't work efficiently, and we give financing. We finance those who work, but open like 2 or 3 extremely, top-ranked universities in every city instead of funding the police, and start educating people on a higher level.
It's so we call it a war against corruption, and of course, you have a war on 2 fronts, right? But a war against corruption is a war that has to be fought on many fronts. And I'm glad you brought up the issue of education. Yes, you have an education law, a reform law that was adopted. And yes, changing our culture has a lot to do with education. And having discussions like this, and having our leaders have discussions like this, and trying to implement reforms and telling people about them, okay? What I would say about the police, is that whether it was the agency to reform, that part of it was overhauled, right, in a very visual way, in a very obvious way that we could say, wow, here's a change. And it doesn't operate perfectly. And certainly the police in my country don't operate perfectly. However, there were some very positive things that were done about it that is allowing us to have this discussion right now, to facilitate this and say, okay, what was good about it, what wasn't good about it, what works in other places, and maybe what's not working here that we need to fix next, okay? But maybe, right? Maybe. Yes?
It's kind of hard to go against corruption when our prosecution office is corrupted. Like, even US, we didn't like give any notes of prosecution, even to Yanukovych and all the others. Like, all the countries, Europe, US, whatever, are asking us, like, come on, we need legal documents so we can actually continue holding their money back or actually trying to do something. And we don't really do much.
This is he who raised his hand like this. Are you interested in being a lawyer? I think you should be up here. Again, agency. There are many agencies that probably, in any context of reform, where we can look at to implement these sorts of things. And so, if I said to you, where's the next place we should go with our reform, you may say, well, we're not done with the patrol police. We need stronger women, or we need to really ticket everyone who they pull over. That's a real big problem. Or at least we should probably identify who that was and say, all right, you're in trouble, okay? Because the Pope man, his driver needs to get a ticket for that, right? He violated the law. We're not going to have anyone who's immune from the law, okay? But what's our next step? Okay, so when I conclude in sort of my rosy-eyed picture of the anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine, what I mean to say is that we've got a foundation that's being put here, part of which by people that have done this before, that's very similar to things that have succeeded. Now, we can't just take a law from one place and put it in Ukraine. We can't just take an economic regulation and put it here. We can't just take an agency and create it here. We have to look at our context in which we operate. But some of these measures are pretty general that have been put into place in different reform efforts all around the world. So you pose an excellent question or criticism, or however you want to characterize it. What do we do next? What is our next step? And that's a discussion that I don't have time for, unfortunately, but I would love to, and you have my email. But that's a discussion that that we engage in at Ohio Northern in the context of where our students come from. And we've had 4 graduates from Ukraine, actually, in our 10 years of existence, which I'm very proud of. But how do we do this? What's our next step? What's our sustainable reform?
Privatization.
Privatization. Certainly that's a theme you heard from me. Yes. Maybe that's our next step. I don't know. Let's have a conference. It's again, if I could fix this, then I'd be driving a Porsche. I don't drive a Porsche. So, any other questions? I'm delighted that you all came out to be with me this evening. And we have time, yeah.
Do you facepalm watching like the lawyer TV shows?
The lawyer TV shows. They're very, well, which ones do you watch?
I'm trying to remember those 2 guys where one was like very talented, but he never actually finished. Yeah, the Suits.
Suits. I've never seen Suits. I understand it's funny, like it's a funny portrayal of. The problem with lawyer TV shows in the United States, at least when you learn how United States law works, you realize that those shows do not represent what we do as lawyers in the United States. Largely, we're not in courtrooms, we're writing in what we call motions. And so the big dramatic trials don't quite happen as often. And when they do happen, they're pretty boring. And we don't have, you know, the aha moment or the smoking gun, if you will, when you really catch someone and say, you did kill her. It's not. It's tedious. It's the same as it is here, I'm sure. You're writing, you're researching.
All the time.
Yeah, it's a nice suspension of our reality. And sometimes they get the law wrong. And that's even more frustrating because there's no way a judge would let him say that. But they say it anyway. So, yeah. So let that be a warning.
Do the students who say like 4 graduates from the university, do you keep in touch? Do you know what are they doing now? Did they come back or like?
Yeah, all of our students are back here in Ukraine. We're having dinner tomorrow. I've seen 2 of them already.
They are working in the public sphere or?
Yeah, we'll talk about it afterwards. And maybe we can get you connected with them. But our program, like I said, is designed for lawyers to come and learn rule of law and then come back home. And so we have, for all of you listening, we have lots of tuition scholarships available for students because we try to get students from places that are dealing with this problem. And we know that students in places that are dealing with this problem don't have lots of money to go to school in the United States, which is very, very expensive. And so we sort of have an idealist mission that we can bring students to our small town in Ohio, our university town, and together learn about rule of law reform and democratic governance on the condition that you return home. And so our tuition scholarship agreements usually say, you will come back to your home country and presumably try in whatever way you can, even if it's a very small way, put into practice what you learn with us. And 97% of our graduates have done just that. So we've had 99 graduates, so 97% of our graduates have done that. So yeah, I'd be happy to connect you with our alumni base here and many in the region. With the Education USA tour, I'm headed next to Azerbaijan and then Georgia, and we have graduates in both of those countries, which is great. So that means lots of reunions for me. Yeah, but a good question. I mean, that's what we do. Any other questions? So if this were an American classroom, I would have done a lot less talking. And so I would have said, what are the causes of corruption? And you would have had to do the reading that I assigned you. And then you would have had to tell me. And I would ask you, why? Why is this a cause of corruption? And you would have to tell me why. And I'd say, do you agree with that as a cause of, and then we'd go on. And it's okay to make a mistake because that's how we have discussions and learn from each other. It's okay to have a different opinion because that's how we have discussions and learn from each other. That's the Socratic Method. It is a beautiful and horrifying thing because it means you have to do a lot of work and prepare. But it also helps us learn from one another. and come to a common understanding. It's a great way to study law. And so if you do make your way to the United States to study law, you will experience this. And I can tell you, having experienced it as a student, it is terrifying. But you learn to realize that it's a great way than just a lecture and then, okay, what did Professor Anderson say? I'm going to write that on my exam. It helps with our critical thinking and really questioning, as we're doing here a little bit. I don't know if that's right. I think maybe we can look at evidence that supports another way, or maybe I can have another opinion. And we can agree to disagree, and I'll tell you why I'm right. And so it's a great way to learn and study. You had a question?
So the duration of your course is 1 year, yeah?
Yes, 9 months, 1 year. Yes.
Do professors actually teach like a big portion of the classes? Like some universities, you rarely actually see the real professor.
Yeah, so that's more common, I think, in large universities and large sort of entry-level classes. So often we say, PhD students teach classes at large universities, and rightly so, they're PhD students. No, all of our classes are taught by professors, whether they're tenured faculty, tenure-track faculty, or visiting faculty from other institutions. And so, and we're also relatively small class sizes. Our graduating classes have been, 10 to 16 students, and we keep it that way for a variety of reasons. But there's a lot of interactions. If you contact any of our students, and they'll tell you my door is always open. We also have a lot of cultural activities. We have a study trip in Washington, D.C. for a week that we spend a week together visiting governance institutions in Washington and posing these sorts of questions to bureaucrats and government officials in Washington that we're doing here. But it's very, very engaged faculty with the students. And so coming with questions and emailing, like I said, email me with questions. Yeah, so always a professor.
That's awesome.
I think so. I like it.
Speaking about the United States, do you have any kind of authority that is like our Anticorruption Bureau, something like that? What's the questions about corruption in the United States? I'm sure you still have some.
Oh, certainly.
Well, of course you.
Certainly. So we've got several regimes that fight corruption. We've got government agencies have oversight bureaus. So we've got the Government Accountability Board in Washington. We have audits of government funding. We, of course, have open procurement processes, and we have very transparent governance. But we still have problems. We also have problems with corporations, certainly engaging in corruption. That's why with my class, we study a little bit the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is the United States codified law, which gives us jurisdiction to criminalize bribery in other jurisdictions by having some connection to the United States, whether it's a U.S. corporation, whether it's a corporation that trades publicly in the United States. We can get them for their corporate or for their corrupt activities. So Ford Motor Company, I mean, this is an example, hypothetical. I don't want to get sued by Ford Motor Company. Okay, not Ford Motor Company, a motor company comes to Ukraine and bribes the government to operate business. We will prosecute them in the U.S. under our criminal code, under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We have a lot of checks. But again, the biggest criticism that I draw attention to is the political financing, the campaign finance system, which is largely legal in the United States, but questionably so. So ethically and philosophically, we can say what exactly is going on here if a candidate receives a large donation from an energy company and then votes in favor all the time for the energy companies, or from a human rights organization and votes in favor all the time for a human rights organization. Is that just consistency?
But how does your lobby act work then? Well, as far as I know, you have official lobby, so it should be like legal.
Yes, well, yes, there's regulations and there are limitations, but we face the appearance of impropriety with our electoral system. And so that's something that we have to let our media investigate and either accept or reject. And largely we accept it. But it's worth discussion, yeah.
If you want to work in the United States as a lawyer and you want to work like in different states, you should have like different licenses.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I mentioned early on, our program is not one that allows you to practice as a lawyer in the United States because we don't teach the kinds of courses that you need. All of our lawyers in the United States have taken a bar examination, a licensure examination, and each state has their own examination. So there's no federal examination that I can be a lawyer. There's kind of a map on the wall over there. I can't be a lawyer everywhere. I'm a lawyer in Ohio, which is where I took the bar exam, which was dreadful. But I passed, and so I have a license to practice in Ohio. I can take another bar exam in New York and practice there. I'm never going to do it again. It was a dreadful experience, and I don't practice now. But you can take certain courses. There are certain LL.M programs in the United States that give you the coursework you need. If you have an LLB, you can take some courses in American law that qualify you to sit for a bar examination. And we can talk about that later, off camera. We don't, I don't want, the World Wide Web is listening, and I'm here to talk about Ohio Northern University. Yeah, but that's a good question. That's, some lawyers do that. Typically New York is where they oftentimes practice because that's a hub of international practice. But there are others. Florida is one of them that's growing with trade with South America and maybe Cuba soon. Maybe. It's another fun topic of conversation. Any other questions? You're all ready for, it's Friday night. I don't know what happens on a Friday night at 8:30 p.m. in Ukraine.
You want us to go?
You should switch off the camera.
Oh, we should switch off the camera. All right, everybody, good night. To my loving wife, I love you. No. So thank you very much. Don't turn off.